Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. And I'll go to slideshow. Okay, so you now can see.
Yes, sir, we can see, sir.
Very good. So, Dr. Huda, as it happens, what I'm going to present to you is from a recent paper of mine in the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, but
yes,
it's also a chapter.
Yeah.
It's also a chapter in which you will recognize from my Planning in the 20th Century and Beyond, the Planning Commission and the Niti Aayog book
yes,
of
sir.
Cambridge University Press. So I thought this would be an appropriate topic given the rubric of your training program. So what I plan to do is sort of, I don't know, speak for about, I understand this session is 1.5 hours.
Yes, sir, 1.5 hours, sir.
Right. So
you take 1 hour and then
I speak for about 45 minutes or so, 50 minutes, and then you have plenty of time for discussion.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me start. So what I plan to do by way of introduction is to tell all our listeners that for 30 years, India has not had a manufacturing strategy or an industrial policy. Now, this becomes particularly worrying given what we know about how dependent we have become in recent years on imports from China in particular. So there is a certain security dimension to the question that I'm raising, but I'm not going to discuss that at all. That is not the objective of this. The point is, any country which is a developing country needs an industrial policy. And let me talk about that. And so that's what I'm going to try and do here. This is always a problem. This, okay. So why does a country like India need a manufacturing strategy? This is what I want to begin with. Okay. In the process of development, what we know is that people move out of agriculture, move into industry, and then in services. And one of the main reasons why people do that is because productivity in manufacturing is higher than either in agriculture or in services. And because productivity is higher, incomes are higher in industry generally, and in manufacturing in particular. So, which is the reason why the process of structural transformation is characterized by the share of output in manufacturing and industry broadly increasing at the expense of agriculture and of services. Unfortunately, in our country, industry and manufacturing has not been a leading sector. What do I mean by leading sector? It is not a sector which has grown faster than the rest of the GDP. So while we might have become a fast-growing economy, and for 15 years, we were the second fastest growing large economy of the world after China. And in the last several years, we had become, before the pandemic, the fastest growing large economy. But unfortunately, manufacturing was not the sector which was driving that economic growth, because manufacturing might have been at times growing at the same rate as GDP or at rates slightly lower than GDP. So it was not the leading sector. And I would say that a foundational reason for this is that India has not had an industrial policy. Now, it's not just that productivity is higher in manufacturing. It's also that manufacturing is a source of productivity gains across the primary and tertiary sectors. meaning across services and across agriculture, through the spread of technological change, because embedded technology in the form of manufactured products or processes or innovations that take place in manufacturing actually spread across the economy, and therefore they raise productivity across the economy. It's not just that manufacturing itself has higher productivity. So this is another reason why a country which is planning to develop into a high-income country, a high human development country, should also be focusing on manufacturing. So manufacturing actually thereby becomes an engine of economic growth, because it provides greater opportunities for the economies of scale, for embodying technical progress. It generates forward and backward linkages with positive spillover effects in the economy in ways which are more multifarious than you can say for agriculture and industry. In fact, Danny Roderick, one of the world's best-known development economists, says that countries with larger manufacturing sectors grow faster as well, and he demonstrate this in a paper in 2011 based on empirical evidence internationally. And you can think about it. I just began by talking about China, and China's experienced one of the fastest growth in human history, and in 30 years they grew from 1980 to about 2010 at the rate of 9 to 10% per annum, and manufacturing was their lead sector. It drove growth, which is the reason why they are called the factory of the world. If Asia is called the factory of the world, major reason is because of China, and that's primarily because of its manufacturing prowess. You walk into the supermarket of any, or the department store of any rich country across the globe, Japan, Australia, North America, all of Europe, Latin America, and our own country, department stores are full of Chinese products. How did that happen? It happened over this period because of their manufacturing prowess. I've just given you arguments about why a manufacturing strategy is good for any country, but why do we now need a manufacturing strategy in our country? Well, one reason, if there weren't enough reasons already, is that 100 countries have developed an industrial policy after 2008. Why 2008? Because 2008 was the year of the global economic crisis, which impacted most countries adversely, their economies adversely. But believe it or not, India has not had an industrial policy since 1991. This may shock you, but you look at the government's papers and you'll not find a single document. Yes, the previous government, UPA, did come up with a manufacturing policy for 2011, but it never managed to implement it, unfortunately. So while 100 countries have developed an industrial policy, because the exogenous shock of the economic crisis post-2008 was so great, they felt vulnerable and they decided to create an industrial policy, but not India. Now you may ask, well, what about Make in India? This government has been talking about Make in India. But Make in India has been confined so far, except for the most recent, few months when PLI was announced. We can come back to PLI later, Performance Linked Initiative. But the point is, it was focused on two things. One, ease of doing business, and two, encouraging foreign direct investment. That was it. But had Make in India been so successful as a strategy, manufacturing share of GDP, would it be stuck at 16%? Well, it was 16% in 1991. And in 2018, it was still 16%. And since then, it has actually fallen by 2 percentage points. So much for the success of Make in India. Manufacturing share of GDP has fallen. I want you to understand this. And manufacturing share of employment has fallen under this government, under Make in India. It had been rising between 2004-05 and 2012, manufacturing share of employment from 10.5% to 12.8% of total workforce was then in 2012 employed in manufacturing. That fell to 11.5% again. So both in respect of manufacturing contribution to GDP as well as manufacturing contribution to employment, it has fallen under this government. I mean, just by way of comparison, I should tell you that Bangladesh has a higher share of manufacturing in GDP. Manufacturing and employment than India. We are at 11.5% and they're at 16%. So if we want to resume the path of structural transformation, India cannot skip the manufacturing stage, because a manufacturing policy and a manufacturing capacity would serve the generation of modern service sector jobs. Because what are services? Services, by definition, are servicing the distribution or the production of goods. Who produces the goods? Well, agriculture does, and industry does. Industry here includes mining and construction and manufacturing. The services sector services it, services both of them, distributes the product, engages in trading, finances it, flies people around, the trains run, cars run. Those are services, right? But if output is not growing at a rapid rate, how rapidly can services grow? Which is an important reason why services growth in our country has grown by default, not by choice, not on account of a strategy. It has grown by default. And anyone who wants to move out of agriculture and doesn't get a job wants to end up, of course, in government, but doing what? Services. Offering services. And what has happened because of the lack of an industrial strategy in our country is that services have come to dominate both employment and output structure in our economy. So if we want to resume the path of structural transformation, it's critical that we return to a manufacturing strategy, because we cannot skip that stage. There's another reason. Employment is not growing in the non-farm sector rapidly enough. It was growing, non-farm employment, I want you to know, I'll come back to this employment issue in a minute, but non-farm employment was growing at the rate of 7.5 million per annum, all the way from the year 2000 to 2012. But its growth fell before the pandemic to under 3 million new non-farm jobs in industry and services taken together after 2012. And what has happened is that while earlier underemployment was very much an agriculture feature and a feature of agricultural sector, but now it has come to dominate traditional services. So the vast majority of those who are underemployed are informally employed in traditional services. I mean, job growth is happening in the services, and modern services jobs have risen in response to the growth of the economy, but formal jobs are confined to modern services, and modern services don't generate that many jobs. What are modern services? Railways, airlines, financial intermediation, pensions, health, education, banking, insurance. These are modern services. But all these require a certain level of education, while the vast majority of our workforce is not that well educated, a subject that I will come back to. So what I'm trying to emphasize to you is that what we are on is an unsustainable growth strategy, because what we need to do is to absorb more than 5 million new additions to the labor force every year, much more than 5 million, because there are now millions who are unemployed. Unemployment was already at a 45-year high by 2019. In addition, there are millions who want to leave agriculture. And on top of that, new young people are joining the labor force. So we have to generate many more than 5 million new non-farm jobs per annum, for which manufacturing growth is essential. How have we done compared to the East Asian countries? You know, Malaysia tripled the share of manufacturing value added in GDP between 1960 and 2014 to reach 24%. What did I tell you earlier? Our share was 16% till 2 years ago. It has fallen since then. In Thailand, manufacturing contribution rose from 13% to 33%. Vietnam, Bangladesh, they've also seen sharp increases in recent decades. And in India, we've never exceeded 17%. And as I just said, it has actually fallen. Okay, so I'll move on quickly. This I've already said, you know, that the growth of non-farm jobs fell drastically after 2012. For 12 years, India had already demonstrated robust non-farm job growth. So there is ground for optimism. We have done it before. If you look carefully, what you can see here, give me a second, I want to move my screen. Yeah, right. What you're seeing here is what I've just said, that per annum, between 1999-2005, as well as 2005 to 2012, we were generating nearly 7.5 million new non-farm jobs per annum. So clearly unemployment rates remained at 2%, 2.2%. But look at the number to the far right. How many non-farm jobs have we been generating recently? And this is a part of the problem of our serious underemployment and serious unemployment rates. And what is tragic, as I hinted earlier, is that while manufacturing employment was growing at a reasonable pace, not at a terribly fast pace until 2012, it has actually shrunk. It has actually shrunk in recent years under the so-called Make in India program. So what kind of a growth strategy do we need for manufacturing to grow? I'm now homing in on what I really want to say in this presentation. I'll come to manufacturing and what would be the components of a manufacturing strategy in a minute. But before that, I need you to appreciate that for manufacturing to grow, for industry generally to grow, we have to make sure that rural distress declines and our agrarian sector actually generates much higher incomes than it has been currently doing. You know, the farm law agitation, the 3 farm laws agitation, is simply a reflection of the ongoing crisis in rural areas and of the agricultural sector over the decades. And I need you to appreciate and understand that the Chinese manufacturing success story and generally the East Asian manufacturing success story was built upon a prior agrarian revolution. In fact, when the Chinese began their economic reforms in 1979, they spent a whole decade reforming their agriculture. They did not begin by reforming industry. We focused our attention after 1991 on reforming the regulation, opening up the economy, etc. But largely, those reforms affected industry and trade and affected the manufacturing sector. We did not carry out the kind of reforms that were necessary in agriculture. And hence we are facing an agri-crisis. You see, if we were to focus not on input subsidies, simply providing minimum support price for agriculture, rather focus on investment in the agrarian sector, it would generate an endogenous growth model with rising demand for manufacturers and hence the supply of manufacturers, because agricultural produce is also provides supply of inputs for the production of manufacturers. But in some ways, more importantly, what agricultural growth will enable the country to do is actually allow growth to happen, income growth to happen in agriculture, and that would generate demand for manufacturers. One of the reasons why our manufacturing sector is not as thriving as in East Asia is because growth of output and incomes in the agrarian sector has been relatively limited. And I would argue, and I won't say very much on this subject any longer after this slide, India faces a fork in the road in our agrarian strategy. Either we continue with our decades-old strategy of providing MSP for outputs and support that with input subsidies, free or highly subsidized diesel or electricity or water. And when this strategy begins to fail, you start offering cash support to farmers through PM Kisan. Either we continue along this road or we move towards an agriculture investment-based model to raise productivity. So India, I'm essentially saying, faces a fork in the road in its agrarian strategy. And we just must remember that the literature demonstrates for us that in China, agriculture proved 4 times more effective in poverty reduction than industry or services. But of course, it's not just focusing on agriculture. It's also that China ensured labor absorption of workers from the farms in the non-farm sectors. India, unfortunately, because it's failed its agriculture and did not have an industrial policy, faces a situation where 42 to 44% of its workforce, which is in agriculture, produces 15% of India's GDP, which shows how low is the productivity of agriculture, because if 42% of our workforce produces 15% of our GDP, it shows dramatically how unproductive our agriculture is. So essentially, an endogenous growth model would suggest the following, that agricultural growth would create the demand for manufacturers because it produces wage goods which generate non-farm rural jobs, and it pulls workers out of agriculture into manufacturing and construction. Okay, all this I've already said, that that manufacturing share of GDP was 16% and has remained unchanged, and in fact has recently fallen. Manufacturing employment has actually fallen. So what went wrong with the 1991 industrial policy statement? Because the last industrial policy statement was in 1991 when the economic reforms began. Okay, so let me spend a few minutes talking about that. I mean, unlike East Asia, in 1991, we did not adopt an explicit manufacturing policy. And for 29 years, since 1991, we have not had that. All that the 1991 industrial policy statement said, that we are going to reduce the sectors in which the public sector will operate, we will reduce, we will deregulate, we will de-license, we will cut tariffs, we will remove non-tariff barriers, we will encourage foreign direct investment. That's essentially it. It was a sort of implicit manufacturing policy, and a very skimpy one at that. It was just assumed all along that if we did all of that, manufacturing will thrive on its own. Well, that's not the way manufacturing thrived in East Asia or in China. So what were the problems with what we did? We needed to carry out those reforms, but we needed to supplement those, which is what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my presentation. But what is it that we actually did and left it at that? The first thing we did, of course, was to rightly reduce tariffs from an average of 150% on imports in 1990 to about 40% in 1998, within a matter of 7-8 years, and rapidly then again to 10% from 40% by 2002. But in this process, there were still 3 issues. What were the 3 issues? One, the speed of reduction was very fast. It was not just that it was very fast, we reduced tariffs well below the WTO upper bound rates. In other words, we would have remained compliant with WTO rules even if we had not reduced our tariffs so fast and so much. In a majority of products, we reduced our tariffs to rates below the upper bound, the upper limit of rates provided for in WTO agreements, which unfortunately, of course, affected our small as well as large manufacturers very adversely. So a process of deindustrialization suddenly set in. I could give you examples of that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to avoid that. There was a second problem with this implicit strategy. You see, you will recall that in the 1950s, as part of the second 5-year plan strategy of heavy industry first industrialization, which was not going to generate jobs, and Mahalanobis and Nehru knew that, they decided that they will reserve products for small-scale industries, which will be produced only by small-scale industries, and corporates will not be allowed to produce those. Now, beginning slowly, the number of products which were reserved for small-scale industries increased over time to 836 products. Now, what we did after 1991 is the following, that we reduced tariffs, allowed international competition to come in, allowed the multinationals to start producing those same products that were being produced by small and large manufacturers within India. But we didn't end reservations for these products for small-scale industries. In other words, we permitted international competition first instead of permitting domestic competition first. Had we, started ending the list of reserved products quickly in the first 5 years after 1991, that would have generated domestic competition and perhaps enabled the weakest of the small manufacturers to die and others to continue because they could meet the competition. But unfortunately, the reservation policy continued. Reservation policy, you won't believe it, continued all the way till 2005, good 15 years after the economic reforms began. So, it'll surprise you to know that while in 1991, 836 products were reserved, in 2005, still 500 products were reserved. And policymakers of that generation, and I've spoken to them, they all agreed that we shouldn't have done that. We should have removed the reservations much earlier. Those policymakers, I won't name them, they've actually read my chapter in this book that Dr. Huda was talking about. So this was a problem. It led to deindustrialization again. There was a third problem, the structure of tariffs. You see, post 2002, we signed a number of free trade agreements. And the result of signing free trade agreements was the following, that an inverted duty structure emerged, which adversely affected our manufacturers. What is an inverted duty structure? It means the following, that finished or consumer goods tariffs were reduced. So imports flooded in, and the finished goods tariffs were actually lower than the tariffs on raw materials or intermediate inputs, which could be used for domestic manufacture of the same products. So on finished goods, the tariffs were relatively low. The tariffs, on the other hand, on raw materials or intermediate inputs were higher. And this is called an inverted duty structure. When what should have happened is the exact opposite, because what this did was to reduce the effective rate of protection for domestic producers. Because if you have a higher tariff on finished goods, then there is an encouragement to produce domestically. If you keep a lower tariff on the raw materials needed and intermediate inputs needed for domestic manufacture of the same products. Unfortunately, we allowed an inverted duty structure to emerge, which has very adversely affected our manufacturing. Okay, so let me move on quickly. So what do we need to do? The first component of a manufacturing policy in our country is that we need to articulate a manufacturing strategy, but it must be aligned to our export and import policy, which is what is implied in my last slide. And the import policy since the early 2000s has simply been unaligned to the manufacturing goal. So one among the first things we need to do is to correct the inverted duty structure which has emerged. And therefore, we need to examine the effective rates of protection being offered. And I'm not so sure that the current government has been actually systematically doing this. And I want you to know that both CII as well as FICCI have been making a case for correcting this IDS duty structure for nearly a decade without being heard by our government. it's true that since 2014, tariff changes in electronics have improved. And the result is domestic electronics manufacturing has grown. But unfortunately, most of the components of domestic electronics manufacturing are all imported. So what has happened is that if you look at the manufacturing alone balance of trade, our imports well exceed our exports. And these low effective rates of protection actually, and the IDS phenomenon exists for paper and paper products, chemical and chemical products, pharmaceuticals, computers, electronics and optical products, machinery and equipment, and other transport equipment. Now, it was believed that the introduction of the goods and services tax in the middle of 2017 would level the playing field between domestic producers and international producers, because it provides for the refund of unutilized input tax credits where credit accumulation is happening due to the inverted duty structure. But a level playing field is not consistent with the infant industry argument. Those of you who teach or have grown up learning about international trade, the infant industry argument has been a standard argument that developing countries use for protecting their manufacturing. And unfortunately, a level playing field is not what you need. What you need for Indian manufacturing to thrive is a playing field which is tilted in our favor, for which, as I said, the inverted duty structure has to be eliminated. Now, important and interesting is the contrast between the sectors that I named above earlier, just now, electronics, etc., with automobiles. The automobile sector has truly thrived in our country. You know, it will interest you to know that we are among the second or third or fourth largest manufacturer of most automobiles, whether it's two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, trucks, lorries, buses, you name it. We have become that. And the reason for that is, major reason is that there is no inverted duty structure adversely affecting the auto sector. In addition, we have an auto manufacturing plan. We had one from 2006 to 16, and then we currently have another one continuing from 2016 to 2026. In other words, we did not abandon automobile manufacturing planning. It tells you something that we abandoned the planning commission. We abandoned planning, but thankfully we have not abandoned the manufacturing plan related to automobiles, which is good news, I have to say. And in pharmaceuticals, it's the same story. We've done rather well. It's a story perhaps you're familiar with. So what is the policy implication? The policy implication of the existing IDS structure is it might mean raising some tariffs, but certainly not raising them beyond the WTO upper bounds. But raising tariff alone, which is what this government has been doing systematically for 6 years, will not transform manufacturing, because manufacturing needs many other areas of support, which I will come back to now. What are the other areas of support? First, I think I mentioned to you that manufacturing employment has actually fallen in our country in the last 6 or 7 years. It was increasing until 2012. The 5 sectors which are labor intensive and which account for 50% of all manufacturing jobs in our country are the following: apparel and garments, textiles, food processing, wood manufacturers and furniture, leather and footwear. Now, these 5 sectors also obviously have a potential for export, but more for growing domestic demand, because demand has been actually growing. And what I want you to understand is that between 2004, 5, and 11, 12, we were seeing rising aggregate demand in the economy and jobs were growing. Rising aggregate demand because jobs, non-farm jobs were growing. And real wages were growing, because real wages were growing in rural as well as urban areas, for casual workers as well as for regular workers. It led to a rise overall in demand and rise in consumption expenditure. And that was what, was reducing poverty. But it also led to an increase in demand for simple manufactures. And this is an endogenous pattern of growth which had emerged, which was, leading to a hastening of the structural transformation in our country. Because you really need to appreciate that 45% of India's exports actually come from the unorganized sector, who are suppliers to the organized sector. And these are these labor-intensive sectors which generate exports in the unorganized sector are the ones which also create jobs. And what we are seeing, unfortunately, is that because of the neglect of manufacturing over the last several years, and absent sector-wise packages for these 5 sectors, India has been consistently losing market share to Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia. The current government did provide a package for garments in 2016. It did provide a package in 2017 for leather. But those packages were unfortunately wasted by perverse policies of the following kind. Soon after the garments package was announced, the demonetization came in. Recall that demonetization began in November 2016. And that knocked the bottom out of the unorganized sector, including for the garment sector and for the leather sector. As though that was not enough, the cow slaughter bans and the terrorization of traders who transport the hides and skins of dead cattle, which is the foundation and the basis for the leather industry in India, has resulted in an onslaught essentially upon the leather manufacturing sector in our country. These are the kinds of policies which have undermined manufacturing and manufacturing employment, especially in the unorganized sector, but not only in the unorganized sector. These are the perverse policies that I'm talking about. Why put in place a package, a policy package for garments or for leather, if you counteract that with these other perverse policies? So what we need, in other words, are special packages for these 5 sectors. I won't have the time to go into what precisely goes into those special packages, but essentially the focus needs to be on, small and medium enterprises. And what we need to do is to stop disincentivizing SME growth. Now, what do I mean by this? I think I need you to understand that the government of India has for decades been offering financial and non-financial incentives to micro, small, and medium enterprises. But the important and interesting thing that you may not be aware of is that if you offer incentives only to the micro, small, and medium, that means you are encouraging, in much the same way as you were encouraging through the reservations, the SMEs to remain small, because the SMEs would have lost their benefits in the reservations regime if they became too large, and they wouldn't then be able to produce those products, because large enterprises were not allowed to produce products which were reserved. Similarly, you are still incentivizing financially micro, small, and medium enterprises. But if a firm becomes medium or large, in other words, through its own efforts, those benefits disappear. That means you fall off a cliff of incentives if you grow. So why would you grow? Why would you want to grow? Now, which is a foundational problem with our manufacturing competitiveness, even compared to Bangladesh and Vietnam. Just yesterday evening, I was speaking to a webinar in Hanoi, in Vietnam. And my God, they have become a manufacturing powerhouse of Asia. All the companies that are leaving China, and which we were planning to attract 1 year ago, have either gone back to Japan because the Japanese government was offering them incentives, or they went to Vietnam. Vietnam got most of them. We hardly got anything. If we continue with these kind of policies, unfortunately, we are not going to get more. And notice that this component is about labor-intensive industries, because these will also create jobs that will raise aggregate demand for other products, both agricultural as well as manufacturing, as well as for services. So in other words, there was a certain pattern of growth where both supply and demand was growing simultaneously because of the strategy that had been adopted until 2012. What's a third component of an industrial policy? Cluster development to support MSMEs with production linkages with larger units. This is an established strategy of late industrializers. Cluster development is, and India has been a laggard in this respect. I need you to appreciate and understand that there are 5,500 organically grown clusters of manufacturing across the country. And 3/4 of non-farm employment in our country is unorganized, and most unorganized meaning in units which employ less than 10 workers. And most of these are in these 5,500 clusters. Of these, 1,450 odd are modern industry clusters, another 4,000 are handloom, handicraft, and other traditional product clusters. And an established strategy is focused support by the government to these clusters. It's an established strategy which was adopted in China, which has been supported by UNIDO, the UN International Industrial Development Organization. We started with a cluster development program around 2005. We came to it rather late in the day, but unfortunately, our cluster development program suffers from several problems. And what are they? The cluster development programs are distributed across different ministries. One major set of programs is run by the MSME ministry, another by the textiles ministry, another by other ministries. And these are intended to raise productivity and quality, but there are 3 problems with them. One is finance. These are poorly funded programs. Less than 1,000 crores is allocated annually for 5,500 industry clusters across the country. This is so little that you barely get 50 lakh rupees, perhaps, for one cluster. For 50 lakh rupees, you can barely get the building of the district industrial center painted and a little refurbishment of that. So you need increased funding. The second problem is that each of these ministries offers the main support in respect of technology or skills or market development or credit through vertical programs. In other words, you have a separate program for skill development, another program for technology development, another for market development, and of course the banks or SIDBI is operating in the area of credit. But in one cluster, let us say the Moradabad cluster, which manufactures brassware and exports a vast amount of brassware across the globe. Moradabad cluster needs all 4 types of services within that cluster. It's not much good if you're offering technology support in Moradabad and you're doing technology support and skill development support in Firozabad, few hundred kilometers away, and doing market development in another cluster. What you need is all 4 types of support for each cluster, which requires more money. So you need cluster level integration of these input services. Thirdly, I don't have to tell you how poorly educated and poorly skilled our workforce is. I could deliver a separate lecture on that subject for you. I won't go into that. But what we also need is skill development. Now, how can that be done in these areas? If you want to upgrade the skills of the workers, who are mostly poorly educated, poorly technically skilled, have no formal certification. What is needed is that the district industry centers, DICs, you probably know about, and the industry associations operating in each one of these clusters need to work together to bring vocational training providers from the NSDC, from ITIs, etc., to provide skills needed which are in demand in these clusters. So in other words, you need a panoply of policies to improve the cluster development program. How great is the potential for clusters? I think I need you to understand. 100 clusters in China just to manufacture socks. They have 100 clusters. If you're wearing shoes right now and you check where your socks were made, you'll find that your socks were made in China. Because you get this kind of specialization when you have economies of agglomeration resulting from clusters. So, as I argue in this paper, India could induce new clusters along the 5 industry infrastructure corridors along the Golden Quadrilateral that are partly in the process of being constructed. And global value chain participation could also be encouraged along the eastern coast industry infrastructure corridor, which is called the Vizag-Chennai Industrial Corridor. What is component 4? Let me quickly just check how much time I've taken. Give me a second. Yeah. I'll finish in the next 10 minutes or so. Component 4, well, this is quite important and it is complementary to the cluster development. Most mid-sized towns in India, which is where the clusters are, have poor infrastructure. So what we need to do is to align urban infrastructure development with manufacturing clusters to create jobs. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is the following. Well, the Ministry of Urban Development funds a program called Amrut. Now, Amrut is intended for relatively small towns and cities to upgrade their infrastructure. Infrastructure investment for small towns. Now, if Amrut was to be directed to towns and cities where these manufacturing clusters are located, it would attract manufacturing investment into the clusters, which would enable MSME growth and jobs to grow. But unfortunately, the Ministry of Urban Development is not choosing towns which have clusters. So what this requires is that the two ministries, MSME and Urban Development, need to coordinate. A second proposal I would offer is that the government should deploy the priority sector lending of the banks. You know, the government of India, sorry, the Reserve Bank requires all scheduled commercial banks to allocate 40% of its credit outflow for agriculture and for MSMEs. 22% for agriculture, 18% for MSMEs. That's called priority sector lending. Now, every year banks are required to reach this 40% goal together. But often banks don't reach that. And the argument I'm making is that this shortfall from the priority sector lending should go to SIDBI, which is the Small Industries Development Bank of India. And the same thing happens with the RIDF fund of NABARD, the Rural Industrial Infrastructure Development Fund of NABARD. In other words, the shortfall is passed on in the RIDF is passed on to NABARD. And I'm saying scheduled commercial banks should pass on this shortfall to SIDBI to lend to state governments as soft loans for infrastructure and cluster development in their states. Because better infrastructure in small towns will also prevent youth, who are all much better educated than before, from migrating to larger cities. Because what we do know that there is a sharp contrast between the pattern of urbanization, for instance, in India versus the pattern of urbanization in China. This would interest you, and this supplements my point about infrastructure for small towns where clusters are. You see, if you look at the pattern of urbanization in China, you'll find that about half of the urban population of China is located in mid-sized towns. In our country, half of the urban population is located in tiny towns and cities. What is, with a limited amount of scarce resources that governments have, if you're trying to improve infrastructure, you should try to improve it in mid-sized towns, not in metros, not in state capitals, but in mid-sized towns, which is where preferably the clusters are. And that would attract the population to those mid-sized towns in much the same way that urbanization has happened in China. Fifth, human resources. Well, it's not just that East Asia had an industrial policy. East Asia also had an education and a vocational education and training policy designed to underpin that industrial policy. What do we need? We need to locate training in these clusters that I've been talking about. If we located training in these clusters, one advantage would be that that is where the jobs are. So these young people who are getting better educated would get trained there, near where they are, and get employed right there, because the jobs are in the unorganized sector in the clusters. A second advantage would be that government will be able to bring industry on board. Industry engagement in skilling becomes easier, because an industry engagement is very important to the success of skilling, because government doesn't really know very well what are the skills in demand. Industry does. Well, the industry is right there. The jobs are right there. And ensuring skilling where the jobs are would ensure easier engagement of industry in the skilling process. The third advantage of locating training in clusters is that if you locate jobs, if you locate your skill centers in the clusters, it enhances demand for skilling, especially for girls, because currently one of the problems is that young people, after they finish secondary education or higher secondary education, they still want to continue into tertiary education and study what? Hindi, Sanskrit, history, political science, and then become unemployable. Wouldn't it be much better if they acquired a vocational skill at these skill centers near the clusters? And this is particularly true for girls, because our girls have gotten better and better educated in the last 10 years or so. And training, as we all know, raises productivity and output quality in manufacturing, and therefore it actually pays for itself. But unfortunately, our skills programs have been supply-driven, managed, and financed by the government. And the result of this is that it leads to mismatches between industry needs and skill priorities. It leads to low placement after skilling. So how do we make them demand-driven? How do they make these skills programs demand-driven? Well, I argue that NSO should collect skills data, statewide skill gap baseline is needed first, and this should not be done by the sector skill councils. I could go on about the TVET reforms, because there's many things that need to happen in the vocational education, but I won't in the interest of time. And I will essentially move to component 6, because I still have to deal with components 7 and 8. So we need to speed up industrial corridors to engage in global value chains for manufacturers. Make for India is an appropriate strategy post-COVID, given the global slowdown. But India was already bypassed by trade in network products in the past. Vietnam accounts for 1% of global trade in network products, and Vietnam's share is double India's share. And look at the size of the two countries. We are 20 times the size of Vietnam. We are building 5 industrial corridors along the Golden Quadrilateral. Land still remains a bottleneck. But if government acquires land in a partnership approach with farmers, rather than leaving it to the private sector, the land acquisition bottleneck can be resolved. Unfortunately, it has been left to the private sector in the case of the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor, which has led to very slow development of this DMIC. So clearly what is needed is much better interstate coordination to be performed by the center and the states together if our industrial corridors along the GVCs are to thrive and thrive quickly. What is component 7? Well, minerals as a foundation. What do I mean by that? Well, in India, mining contributes 2% of GDP, and most of our ample resources of minerals are underground. And unfortunately, the import of minerals is much higher than the export of minerals. And a major reason for this is that small size mines dominate our mining industry. So we need to grow our mineral industry as a foundation for greater industrial and faster industrialization. The public sector still is, 6% of the value of mineral production. The rest, in other words, our Coal India, our other, public sector mining companies, they produce only 6% of value of total mineral production. The rest is all done by small mines. And they are all small private producers. who are relatively inefficient, which is the problem. How important minerals can be to growth of manufacturing. This statistic should tell you 1% increase in the growth rate of manufacturing actually increases the growth rate of industrial output by 1.2 to 1.4%. That's what has been established by research. That's how important focusing on mineral production is to our manufacturing strategy. We have had 100% ownership, which has been permitted by our FDI rules in mining according to the National Mineral Policy of 2016, but it's the FDI is still not flowing into India. So we have a crisis here with mineral production not growing because the government is short of funds and domestic investors are shying away and FDI is still not coming in. So what's the problem? Why? What we need is independent mining regulatory authority to inspire confidence. And this actually is action that will have to be taken at the state level. Finally, India needs to build design capacity at the enterprise level and R&D capacity for a national innovation system. You know, since 1991, our manufacturing strategy has been relatively short-sighted because it's based on the principle that we import the least expensive inputs that any sector in India needs. And this is a short-sighted one. An alternative would be that we develop technological depth by investing in design capacity, investing in learning by doing. You see, technology in most products is under the skin, inside assembled products. Even, in fact, it's even deeper in machines and tools that make the part. Justin Lin, in fact, the former chief economist of the Chinese economist, former chief economist of the World Bank, has argued in his work called New Structural Economics. He relies upon China's industrial strategy experience to argue for a strategy of dynamic comparative advantage through technology development. Earlier I was talking about, you know, industrial policy being aligned to trade policy, and I said we cannot afford to have negative effective rates of protection, but reversing negative ERPs and IDS is not sufficient, nor is protection, meaning raising tariffs alone, a wise policy strategy. What we need to do is to incentivize design capacity building within our own companies, which requires one, enterprise level leadership. It also implies that India's market size is used as an incentive to force design indigenization at when FDI contracts are being negotiated. It's not enough to just say, oh, IKEA is coming in, they must do input sourcing, or Rafael is going to be manufactured here, they can do input sourcing. The design indigenization and transfer of technology needs to be part of our strategy of negotiation when we bring in foreign direct investment. We also need to build macro level learning plans for our enterprises. And the final challenge is translating ideas into solutions. And that requires innovation, an innovation system that converts our S&T research, science and technology research, into innovations in society. India has already demonstrated strength. Over 800 MNCs have located their global R&D centers in India. So clearly we have the skilled labor. Our costs are lower of the skilled labor, and we have good IPR laws which protect these MNCs, and therefore they are located here. But unfortunately, India spends only 0.7% of GDP on R&D. So while there has been a growth in scientific publications and patents filed, but what value do these scientific publications and patents filed serve if they don't convert into usable products and processes. And unfortunately, 2/3 of our total R&D in the country is done by the government, which is the opposite of what happens in more developed economies and more innovative societies, where 2/3 of R&D is done by private firms, which is much more productive. And in any case, in our country, government R&D is focused on defense and space. It takes up 44% of our total R&D expenditure. We spend, of course, much lower than our competitors like China and so on. And